Tonight, we're slipping into the softer, stranger side of the Middle Ages, a time of root brewers, potion makers, and sleepy visions by candlelight. Not war, not plague, but the quiet, curious art of getting high in 1347. But before we begin the story, if you enjoy these gentle journeys through time, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? It's always lovely to see who's drifting off with us around the world. Now, settle in. Let's begin. A garden of forgotten potions. Tonight, we step past the gates of memory and into the hush of a garden long forgotten. It isn't grand, it isn't royal, but if you stood on the soft soil in your bare feet, you might catch a whiff of something strange, sweet, bitter, mossy, and old. And you might wonder, was this where someone once grew dreams? The garden belongs to no one now, but once perhaps it was kept by a healer, or a midwife, or a travelling monk with stains on his robe, and too many stories in his satchel. The stone walls are crumbling now, tangled with ivy, the gate long gone, but the herbs remain. There's henbane by the edge, where the shadows fall the longest. Its pale yellow flowers nod slightly in the breeze. It's the kind of plant that speaks in riddles, helpful sometimes, but always moody. You wouldn't pluck it unless you meant to, unless you knew how, unless you were prepared for visions. Then there's sweet woodruff by the worn bench, soft and low, smelling faintly of hay and vanilla. That one's gentle, makes the wine smoother and the evenings warmer. No danger there, just a little ease. Behind the cracked clay path, mandrake curls like a secret. Its roots, twisted into strange humanoid shapes, seem almost to breathe beneath the earth. Pull it wrong, they said, and it screams. Not metaphorically, a scream loud enough to kill a man. So they tied dogs to the stalks and let them do the dirty work. Poor creatures. The stories never say what happened to them afterward. But let's not rush. Tonight is not a night for speed. Tonight is for soft, slow footsteps, for leaning close to the leaves, for imagining a world where your medicine might also be your myth. In 1347, the world was still turning slowly. The plague had not yet reached every village, but the air carried rumors. Doctors whispered of heat and imbalance. Monks copied herbals by candlelight. And in little corners like this, hidden gardens, crooked cottages, cloistered cells, people were mixing potions, sometimes to heal, sometimes to forget, sometimes to see. Not everyone believed the same things, of course. The church had its suspicions. Visions, they said, must come from heaven. But what if they came from wine boiled with nightshade, or from rubbing a strange balm into your temples under the moon? And what of the barefoot peasant, aching from a week in the fields, who sipped a bitter tea made from poppy and valerian, and dreamed, for the first time in years, of something kind? There were no pharmacies then, only apothecaries. Wooden shelves, stone jars, oils and resins, and the rustle of dried leaves when someone lifted a lid and asked, softly, what will help me sleep? Let's walk along the edge of the garden now. Feel the brush of mugwort at your calves, smell the sage, crushed underfoot. Mugwort, that plant was known to open the mind, to welcome dreams. A few sprigs tucked under the pillow, and the sleeper might meet old gods, dead relatives, or wandering spirits. Not everyone liked that, but some sought it. Further along the wall there's a squat little bush with tiny black berries, glossy and delicate. Deadly nightshade, belladonna. They used it in drops, in oil, just enough to widen the pupils, to soften pain. Too much though, and your breath might slow until it stopped entirely. But still, it was beauty in a bottle. They called it belladonna, beautiful lady, because wide eyes were desirable, and blurred edges, even more so. You see, the line between medicine and magic was blurred. No lab coats, no dosages printed on the bottle, just trust, trial, and a quiet hope that the mix would bring comfort, not chaos. Let's pause near the stone basin. Rainwater pools there, but centuries ago, it might have held an infusion, boiled roots steeped until bitter, then cooled and sipped slowly by someone with a toothache, or a grief too heavy to carry sober. There were roots to forget, seeds to remember, leaves to feel nothing at all, and sometimes petals that made the air sing. Did they know exactly what they were doing? Not always. Some learned from elders, some from monks, some from experience, too sharp to forget, and others from animals even. watching what the deer ate, watching which plants the pigs avoided, and still, they brewed, because pain was pain, and dreams were a kind of medicine too. Tonight we rest in this garden, we listen to the silence it left behind, and we imagine the hands that once moved through it, gathering, grinding, whispering the names of herbs like prayers. So if the world feels a little loud today, just remember, somewhere long ago, someone held a steaming cup of strange tea, looked out over a field of dusk, and felt for just a moment, a little lighter. Let that moment be yours, now. Let the garden fade, let the fog roll in, and let the quiet take root. The monk who grew dreams in clay pots. He lived behind the walls, not of a castle, not of a fortress, but of a monastery, so old it seemed to have grown from the earth, like the trees that surrounded it. The stone was cool and rough, ivy wound up the corners, and the windows let in more breeze than light. Inside, the hours were marked by bells and footsteps on worn floors, chanting in the morning. Silence at dusk. But not all monks lived only by scripture and routine. This one, whose name has long since faded, was different. He tended a garden most others ignored. Small clay pots lined the southern wall of the cloister, where the sun kissed the herbs just enough to wake their oils, not the cabbages and onions for supper. No, these were stranger things. He grew rue and tansy, mugwort and monkshood, basil that wasn't for soup, and marigold not for decoration. Visitors to the monastery sometimes paused near the pots, not for long, just long enough to notice the unusual scents. Warm, spicy, woody, earthy, with something just a little unsettling beneath it all, and if the monk was there, hunched in his hood, he might look up and nod, but never explain. He didn't need to. The plants were his scripture, each one, a verse, each root, a passage, each flower, a mystery waiting to be understood, not through reading, but through careful, quiet experience. The other brothers whispered that he was strange, though not unkind. They said he once saw an angel while brewing foxglove, that he spoke to bees, and that his tinctures made old men weep with dreams of their childhoods. Of course, most dismissed it. They laughed quietly into their porridge. But still, they didn't disturb his garden. He called it the Garden of Sleep. Not because it put people to rest forever, though it could, but because it softened the edges of pain, calmed a troubled mind, and sometimes, if the mixture was just right, gave the dreamer a glimpse of something deeper. In the little stone room behind the garden, the monk kept a book, not a Bible, but a codex of his own making, drawings of plants, descriptions of effects, notes written in a hand that sloped and curved like roots. Henbane, calms fever, stirs visions, mix with wine, not ale. Valerian, helps soldiers sleep, do not use near childbirth. Wormwood, brings clear dreams. Bitter, prepare only for the ready. Some entries were smudged, others marked with small stars, a secret code known only to him. At night, while the others slept beneath woolen blankets, the monk would light a single taper and stir powders into glass vessels. The air would shimmer faintly with the scent of lavender, then shift into something more metallic, more primal. He wasn't trying to escape the world, he was trying to understand it. One evening, a younger monk barely past his novitiate, knocked softly on the monk's wooden door. "I can't sleep," he said, embarrassed. "I think too much." The older man said nothing at first, just motioned him inside. The young monk watched as his elder chose a small jar, scraped a pinch of something into a bowl, and added warm wine. He handed it over with a nod. Only a sip. The young monk drank, and for the first time in weeks, his thoughts did not chase each other into the night. He dreamed of walking barefoot through grass under stars that hummed softly, and when he awoke, the world felt lighter. He never asked what was in the cup. He didn't need to. In the years that followed, others came, quietly, with headaches, with hearts too heavy, with minds full of storms, and the monk, always calm, always listening, would reach for his jars, not to cure them, not to silence them, but to help them drift softly into a place where their burdens could rest for a while. He never asked for thanks. He never charged coin. He simply returned to his clay pots, whispering to the herbs as he pinched their leaves and murmured the old prayers. Some say, long after he passed, that the monastery's garden bloomed with strange vigor, plants no one remembered planting, flowers that opened only at dusk, dreams that lingered longer than they should, and in the breeze that swept through the cloister, there was sometimes, just sometimes, a scent that no one could name. So tonight, if your thoughts feel heavy, if your mind is noisy, imagine yourself in that quiet room, with its one candle and warm cup, Let the monk hand it to you without words. Let the world soften. Let the shadows stretch long and kind across the floor, because some sleep comes not from weariness, but from being gently, quietly understood. Henbane and the Whispering Forest. The forest never spoke aloud, not the way people do. Its language was quieter, rustling leaves, sighing branches, the low creak of old wood shifting in the wind. But those who listened long enough often said they heard things, not voices, not exactly. Whispers, maybe, thoughts not their own. Strange ideas carried on the air, like spores. At the edge of one such forest, where the trees thickened and the path narrowed to little more than a deer track, a woman lived alone. Her name wasn't written down anywhere. The villagers simply called her Fern. Fern wasn't feared, exactly, but people kept their distance. They said she talked to moss and understood crows, that she brewed potions in earthen pots, and sometimes laughed at nothing at all. In truth, Fern had once lived in the village like anyone else, but she liked silence better than gossip, herbs better than prayers, and the company of trees better than men. So she wandered off one summer and didn't come back, except when someone knocked quietly on the wooden post outside her gate, always at twilight, always with a question they couldn't bring to the priest. Most came for relief, pain in the joints, a restless baby, a husband who screamed in dreams, and sometimes they came because they'd seen something in the woods, or thought they had. Fern never turned anyone away, but she didn't explain much, either. One evening, as the sun melted into the canopy and shadows stretched long and soft across the moss, a boy from the next hamlet came running down the track, pale, shaking. He said he'd eaten something near the stream, a root, round and yellow, like an apple gone sour. Now everything sounded strange. The trees were breathing, the sky was too close. His feet felt like stone. Fern didn't panic. She brought him inside, laid him on a sheepskin rug, and opened her carved wooden box. From within she pulled a bundle, wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside, dried leaves, brittle and brown, smelling faintly of smoke and honey, and something slightly bitter, like the air before a storm. Henbane, the villagers called it devil's herb, said it made you see your own death, or fall in love with a ghost. But Fern knew it better than that. She'd learned from a tanner's widow who once cured her toothache with a black tea that made her dream of wolves made of wind. And later she'd learned from the forest itself, which plants to pair with which, what time of day to harvest them, how much could lead to peace, and how much to madness. She crushed the henbane gently, mixing it with mead and willow bark. Just a drop on the boy's tongue. Then she waited. Outside, the woods creaked softly. Inside, the boy's breathing slowed. Fern hummed an old tune, one without words. A lullaby passed down through women who'd never been taught to write. The boy slept, and when he woke, much later, his eyes were clear. I dreamed of a stag with golden antlers, he said. It told me to follow the wind. Fern smiled, just barely. Henbane doesn't speak plainly. It bends the thoughts, tilts the world sideways. But sometimes in that slant, you see something truer than what's in front of you. After he left, Fern sat beneath the old pine tree behind her cottage, the one with the roots that reached up like fingers. She placed a fresh pinch of henbane on a coal and watched the smoke curl. It wasn't for visions. Not tonight, just for quiet. To feel the edge soften between her thoughts and the trees. To hear the forest, not with ears, but with something deeper. Some said henbane was dangerous. A poison, a witch's tool. But to Fern it was a key, not to open a door, but to remind her there was no door at all, just the forest, and the wind, and the soft, steady rhythm of things growing unseen. So tonight, if your thoughts drift towards strange paths, if your mind wanders where the trees lean close, let it, walk softly, let the henbane whisper, and if you hear the forest speak, just listen. When wine was medicine and sleep, somewhere near the end of an especially long day, when the work was done, the sheep were counted, the bread cooled on the hearth, and the stars blinked into place overhead. Someone would pour a cup of wine, not to celebrate, not even always to enjoy, but because the body ached, and the dreams were restless, and the wind outside whispered of old bones and colder seasons. In the medieval world, wine was not just a drink, it was a kind of promise, a small red comfort, that the night would pass gently, and perhaps, if mixed just right, it might even bring sleep. Of course, it wasn't just wine, not the wine you know. It was thicker, earthier, sour sometimes, and more often than not, it was a base, A beginning, for something else entirely. A carrier, a cloak, a vessel for herbs and powders, crushed resins, and mysterious drops from tiny glass bottles with no labels. Somewhere in a tiled monastery kitchen in southern France, a monk stood over a pot of steaming spiced wine. His name was Brother Anselm. He didn't speak much, but he listened, and he remembered. He remembered the girl who came in with fevers, how she couldn't sleep for days, her eyes wide like cracked porcelain. He'd stirred valerian root into her cup, a slow swirl of bitter calm, and he remembered the merchant too, torn by grief, begging for peace, asking only for one night without dreaming of fire. For him, a darker brew, wine with poppy milk, mulled slowly until the scent made the other monks drowsy, just by passing the corridor. Wine in those years was like a river, and into that river, healers poured their hopes. Sleep was sacred, a fragile threshold. Too much of the wrong herb could send someone past sleep into silence. Too little, and they'd wake with dreams they didn't ask for. There was no science to it, no charts or doses, only instinct, prayer, and stories passed hand to hand like candlelight. One story told of a queen who could not rest. The finest linens could not soothe her, nor did the music of harps. It was said that an old woman came to her chambers one night with a satchel of dried petals and a single flask of red wine. The petals were rose, but not for fragrance. They were for sorrow, mixed with lavender and a pinch of nutmeg, steeped in warm red wine. The mixture was dark and cloying. The queen drank, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. No dreams, just the soft hush of nothingness, the kind of silence that only arrives when the body is no longer afraid. And then there were the wanderers, the apothecaries who travelled with nothing but a donkey, a box of vials, and the knowledge of which wines softened grief, and which ones lit the mind like a lantern. They brewed on the road, in inns, in barns, in the back rooms of bakeries. They never stayed long, but they left behind stories, and sometimes a sleeping farmer or two. Not all mixtures were wise, some were reckless. There were tales of fools who mixed wormwood and fermented grape, and saw angels, or spiders, or worse. But the wise ones, they knew wine was not to be used like a hammer. It was a balm, a slow easing, a thread pulled gently through the chaos of a day. And so, as the village curled in on itself for the night, as shutters were drawn and smoke drifted up into a sky too vast to understand, someone would pour a little wine, maybe add thyme, or elderflower, or just a touch of clove. They would sip it slowly, feel it bloom in the chest, let the body soften, let the thoughts fade. They would lie down not knowing if what came next would be sleep, or a dream, or both. And that was all right, because tonight, like so many nights before, the wine was medicine, and medicine was a kind of love. So if your thoughts are still spinning tonight, if your limbs are still too full of the day, let this be your cup, a quiet invisible wine, warm with memory, gentle with story. And when it's done, let yourself drift, like steam, like breath. The apothecary's shelves and shadowy tinctures. Take a slow breath and picture a narrow room, longer than it is wide, low-beamed and quiet, except for the muffled clink of glass. The air smells like dried mint, dusted parchment, and the faint, rooty sharpness of vinegar that's been simmering for too long. This is the apothecary's back room. No signs, no crowds, just rows and rows of shelves, wooden and bowed slightly with age, lined with jars, pots, and bottles. Some labelled in Latin, some not labelled at all, some sealed with wax, others stoppered with bits of cloth and twine. Here in the soft hush behind the front shop, a sleepy kingdom of curious substances waits in the dark. No one truly knows how many ingredients the medieval apothecary kept. Some said 100, some said more, but all agreed that stepping into that room was like stepping between the pages of a book too old to remember its own title. Somewhere on the upper shelf, dusty and shy, sat a pot of crushed poppy seeds, sweet and heavy, once stirred into honey and pressed into tablets the size of a coin. Next to it, a wax-sealed jar of thick, tarry extract, perhaps opium, or perhaps something else entirely, brewed in haste during the famine, and never used. The label has long since faded, and there, in a row like sleepy soldiers, bundles of dried henbane leaves, curled in on themselves, as though even in death, they were reluctant to reveal their secrets. The apothecary, he might have been called Willem, or maybe Marta, or Brother Sylvanus, depending on the town, moved among the shelves like a librarian of shadows. Every tincture had its tale, every bottle, a warning. He kept belladonna in a dark blue glass, because the plant disliked light and liked to pretend it was a secret. Just 3 drops in a tea might lull a noble woman to sleep. 4 might make her dance. 5, well, 5 was never recorded. Beside it, wormwood steeped in old wine. Its scent was bracing, astringent, sharp as frost on iron. It was once thought to banish worms from the gut, and bad spirits from the mind, and sometimes, it worked. Sometimes, it simply made people see things that weren't quite there. In the corner sat the dried petals of blue lotus, imported rarely and hoarded dearly. A flower of dreams, soaked in wine, or floated in boiling water. Not native to Europe, but stories travelled faster than seeds, and where stories went, the apothecary's curiosity followed. Sometimes, curious nobles would visit, wanting something to forget a scandal, or to conjure courage, or just to sleep. The apothecary would tilt their head, think for a long moment, and select 2 or 3 things without explanation. A root, a resin, a tincture. They were never given names, because if you name a thing, it becomes familiar, and the apothecary's craft thrived in the unfamiliar. Even the shelves themselves whispered. Behind the jars, pressed flat between scraps of linen, were things no one ever asked for twice: scraps of mandrake, powdered to prevent screaming, a bit of dried toad skin, not for effect, but for balance, the curled tongue of an herb no one knew the name of anymore, picked only on solstice nights. Not everything was for dreams. Some tinctures woke you up, some were for childbirth, some for grief, some for easing the fear that came after battle, what they might have called mad soldiers trembling, and some were for visions. These were not sold lightly. A tincture of nutmeg, clove, and a dash of extract from a red berry that only grew in places where lightning had struck the soil, taken under the right moon, with fasting and prayer, it could loosen the knots in a person's mind, make them see patterns in fire, hear music in wind. Sometimes, they called it divine, other times, they called for the priest. But the apothecary didn't judge, only mixed, measured, watched. The shelves were like a forest, and just like a forest, they held both medicine and mystery. A wanderer could heal there, or they could get lost. So they came, quietly, under cloaks and hoods, with soft voices and nervous hands. They asked not for names, but for results, and the apothecary, with the patience of someone who had forgotten more than they remembered, would pass them a bottle, maybe 2, with instructions that read more like riddles than recipes. Boil this in wine. Whisper before drinking. Sleep near the hearth. Dream of rivers. And off they went, into the night, clutching glass like it might break or speak or both. If you could step into that room now, if you could run your fingers along those shelves, you might feel the quiet pulse of 100 forgotten stories, of people who came searching for comfort, for dreams, for silence, and maybe, just maybe, one of those bottles would call to you too. But not now, not tonight. Tonight, the shelves sleep, the bottles breathe slow, and the apothecary, wherever they've gone, is dreaming of tinctures no longer needed. Mandrake and the quiet roots beneath the earth. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a twilight field, the soil dark with evening dampness. A thin mist drapes low across the ground, curling around stone and stem like a secret. The crickets have quieted, the wind is hushed, and somewhere beneath your feet, something ancient waits. It does not move, it does not speak, but it remembers. This is the home of the mandrake root. Not in a glass jar, not ground into powder, not yet. Here in the cold, hidden earth, it dreams in silence, long before it gained its reputation. Before the herbalists, the monks, and the witches, mandrake was simply a plant. A strange one, yes. A root shaped like something half human and half forgotten, thick and twisting. Legs and arms suggested, but never quite formed. Some even said it had a face, if you dared to dig it up and look too long, but most never did. The legends said it screamed, not a metaphorical scream, not the poetic howl of superstition, but a literal ear-splitting cry, a sound so terrible, so filled with rage and sorrow, that it could kill a man outright, which naturally led people to try. The most famous method of harvest was elaborate. You found a mandrake, half buried near the roots of an elder tree, or in the shadow of an old stone wall. You didn't touch it. No, you dug a shallow trench around it, tied a string to it, then tied the other end to a dog. You walked away, far, covered your ears, gave a signal, and the dog did the rest. Whether or not it screamed, no one could say for certain, but the silence that followed was often treated with a strange reverence. The mandrake had been pulled from its sleep, and now it was yours. And yet, despite the theatrics, the real power of the mandrake came not from fear, but from gentleness. Its leaves were unassuming. Its fruit, called devil's apples, looked like small yellow plums and smelled faintly sweet. But it was the root, the twisted, knotted root, that people prized. Dried and sliced, it became an anesthetic. Boiled in wine, it calmed the nervous system. Ground into salve, it soothed pain. Some claimed it brought fertility, others, vivid dreams. A few said if you slept with a mandrake beneath your pillow, you would meet your ancestors in your dreams, and return with secrets you weren't meant to know. Not all believed it. But then again, not all disbelieved it either. Monks kept mandrake in carefully labeled jars. They copied its uses into thick herbals, inked with marginalia, that sometimes seemed uncertain, as though the scribe had heard things, or seen things, or dreamed things he didn't care to put into Latin. Peasants sometimes wore small pieces of the root on cords around their necks, for luck, for love, for protection against spirits that wandered too far from the graveyard. And in quiet places, far from town walls, there were those who used mandrake for deeper purposes. Dream work, they called it. You took just enough, not to sleep, but to drift, to hover at the edge of waking, where shapes take form behind your eyelids and memories slide into visions. It was said you could hear music that didn't exist, that you could speak to birds and understand their replies, that you could weep for a thing you had not yet lost. These were not hallucinations, not to them. These were visitations, invitations to step sideways through the veil of the world and walk among the hidden roots of the soul and the mandrake. It was the guide, the doorway, the voice beneath the earth. Even today, somewhere in old fields where no plough cuts and no foot treads, the mandrake still grows, shy, silent, waiting for the cautious hand, the respectful whisper, the curious heart. You won't find it with force, you won't find it with science, but if you lie very still, with your ear pressed to the ground, you might hear it breathe, or maybe not. Maybe the real mandrake is just a memory now, a root in a jar, a story in a book, a whisper in a dream you had once and forgot, upon waking. But tonight, as you sink a little deeper, as the quiet folds around you like soft earth, perhaps some part of you remembers the shape of it, and that is enough. The root sleeps, the world turns, and you are safe beneath the soil of dreams. The strange sleep of the dancing village? Take a moment, breathe in. Let your shoulders drop. The world can wait. Now, picture this, a warm summer evening, somewhere deep in the Rhineland, a little village, nestled between the forest's edge and a slow-moving river. The houses are half-timbered and heavy, with thatch. Chickens cluck in the shadows. The sound of bells hangs in the air, distant but rhythmic, and at the center of it all, people are dancing. Not just one or two, not even a dozen. The whole square sways with bodies, men and women, barefoot in the dust, spinning, turning, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. A strange, relentless dance. No music drives them. No festival has been declared. They just can't stop. It is 1374, and the town of Aachen is caught in something the physicians have no word for. The clergy call it possession. The villagers call it a curse. But to those caught up in it feels like sleepwalking through a waking dream. This is what came to be known as the dancing plague. It wasn't the only one. Strasbourg, Erfurt, Metz, all the way down to the banks of the Moselle. Stories ripple outward of entire towns overcome by motion. People danced for days, even weeks. Some collapsed from exhaustion, some fell into trances, a few danced themselves to death. But why? Modern historians still argue. Ergot, perhaps the fungus that grows on rye, rich in alkaloids that twist the mind. In small doses, it dulls pain. In larger ones, it can burn the skin and warp reality. It is a cousin of LSD, in a time long before chemistry knew what it had stumbled upon. But in 1347, there were no terms like serotonin or hallucination, only the eyewitness accounts of barefoot children spinning in circles, and mothers who wept even as their feet kept moving. Others blamed demonic forces. Saint Vitus, some claimed, had cursed them. Towns held processions and prayers. They played music to try and soothe the afflicted, but that often only encouraged more dancing. It became a strange public ritual, a town trying to pray and waltz its way back to stillness. For some, the dancing brought visions. One chronicler wrote of a woman who claimed to have seen angels among the hay bales, urging her on. Another man spoke of a black dog that danced beside him, whispering the name of a long-dead brother. And others, many others, remembered nothing at all. only the ache in their bones and the silence that followed. So was it poisoning, mass hysteria, spiritual ecstasy, or something else entirely? The truth may lie somewhere in the spaces between those explanations. After all, medieval life was a crucible of tension, hunger, heat, fear of the plague, the weight of faith pressing on one shoulder, and the spectre of damnation on the other. People did not speak of mental strain the way we do now, but pressure builds, even in silence, and sometimes when the words won't come, the body finds another way to cry out, and so they danced, sometimes alone, sometimes together, sometimes until the sun rose and set again, until the bells stopped, until the world came back into focus, and afterward, a strange sleep, deep, dreamless. Some said they awoke renewed, others haunted. The town went back to normal. The villagers walked barefoot home, muscles sore, minds fogged, and no one quite knew how it had started, or why. For a brief and impossible span of time, they had all surrendered to the rhythm, but they remembered the silence after, the hush that followed the fever of motion, and the air thick with the smell of sweat and rosemary, and something else, something like sorrow. Tonight you lie still, but maybe you can feel it, just a little, that rhythm, that pull, the ache behind your eyelids. No need to resist. This dance is gentle, this sleep is kind. Let it carry you, soft steps through the mist of memory. No saints to fear, no curses to bear, just the quiet turning of a forgotten village, lost in motion, and finally, at rest. A cup of poppy milk before the storm. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the air already knew, heavy, waiting. The sky above the fields was the color of iron, and even the birds had gone quiet. Inside a small, crooked farmhouse on the edge of the manor lands, a woman stirred something gently in a clay cup, steam rising, soft as breath. She didn't speak as she stirred. She didn't need to. This was not a drink for conversation. This was a drink for silence. It was called poppy milk, not quite a medicine, not quite a meal, and not quite a drug. Something in between, as most things were in 1347. A milky infusion made from the pale white seeds of the somniferous poppy, steeped, strained and sweetened with a little barley honey. Children drank it to sleep through fevers. Soldiers sipped it when the pain in their limbs grew louder than the church bells. And on nights like this, when the clouds gathered, and the air itself seemed to lean in close, it was sipped in quiet defiance of the unknown. Because the world in 1347 was changing, whispers came down the trade roads of a sickness in the south, a black wind sweeping in from the sea. No one knew how far it would reach. No one yet imagined how many graves it would fill, but the animals had begun to behave strangely. The sky kept its storms coiled tight, like a fist, and the old women who worked the herb gardens spoke a little more softly when they passed the poppy patch. Poppy milk wasn't about escape. Not entirely, it was about softening the edges. You see, pain in the Middle Ages didn't come with warning labels. There were no pharmaceutical doses, no surgeon's charts. Pain was an everyday companion, and so were the ways people learned to live with it. A crushed seed here, a hot cloth there, and when things got bad enough, a cup of this. It wasn't just used to dull agony, it also brought dreams. Strange ones. Gentle ones, if you were lucky, the kind of dreams where lost faces returned, or you walked through a place that hadn't existed for 100 years. One herbalist claimed he saw a silver horse walking on the surface of a lake after drinking too much of it. Another claimed she spoke with her dead mother, and learned the recipe for a sore throat syrup that never failed. But like most things in medieval medicine, there was a line, and nobody knew exactly where it was. Too little, and the sleep didn't come. Too much, and you didn't wake. Still, the poppy grew everywhere, graceful, upright, with petals like faded velvet. Monks harvested it in the cloister gardens. Peasants gathered the seeds in cloth sacks and dried them by the hearth. It was legal, unregulated, and entirely woven into the fabric of daily survival. The storm outside that night would eventually come. But for now the farmhouse stood still. The cup of poppy milk sat on the table, half empty. A candle flickered near the door, and the dog by the hearth twitched in his sleep, chasing something in his dreams. It's tempting to think of the Middle Ages as an age without comfort. And yes, pain was common, suffering was near. But there was also tenderness, a husband carefully measuring crushed poppy seeds for his wife's childbirth, a grandmother humming softly as she stirred the pot, a wandering healer sharing a cup with a stranger who couldn't sleep because the harvest had failed. There was compassion, even without comprehension. People helped each other sleep and survive. and remember what it was to feel warm even when the world outside was growing cold. And tonight, maybe you can borrow that memory. That quiet farmhouse, that cup of something warm and laced with stillness. No loud machines, no glowing screens. Just the flicker of the candle, the distant hush of the storm, and the faint taste of poppy milk on your tongue, bittersweet, earthy and soft as the edge of sleep. You don't need to know when the storm will arrive. You're not meant to. You only need to rest. Let the air grow heavy, let the cup go cold, let the sky rumble, and let yourself slip gently, slowly into the dream. Nettle, Wormwood, and the barefoot healer. She arrived after dusk, just as the sun folded itself behind the low hills of the western edge of the village. No horse, no cart, no grand entry, just the soft barefoot steps of someone used to being ignored by the rich and quietly welcomed by the poor. She wore layers that looked like they'd been stitched from leftover seasons, faded green, dusty brown and grey that might once have been blue. On her back, a sack that clinked and rustled, filled with bottles, dried herbs and hand-carved spoons. Around her neck, a simple cord, tied with a bone bead. No one knew her real name. They just called her the healer. She didn't stay long in any one place, but when she did appear, it was always when she was most needed, just before the birth that wouldn't turn, just after the fever had already taken two, or when someone's mind had frayed from sleepless nights and too many bad dreams. And always, she carried three things: nettle, wormwood, and silence. The villagers had their tales. They said the barefoot healer had once been a nun who drank from the wrong cup. Others said she'd married a man who turned into a dog and now wandered the countryside trying to undo the spell. But most people didn't ask questions. They only watched what she did and what she carried. Nettle was for waking the blood. It looked like a common weed, and it stung when handled raw, but it was no ordinary plant. The healer used it to flush sickness from limbs, to bring color back to cheeks, to stir warmth into hearts that had grown dull with grief. She'd slap bundles of it, gently, rhythmically, against cold skin to awaken circulation. Mixed into broth, it gave strength. Dried into powder, it was pressed into wax and lit like incense to chase away the air that made men forget their own names. Nettle burned, but it healed. Wormwood was another story entirely. Bitter, strange, ghost-colored when fresh. This plant didn't soothe, it stirred. It was used when sleep refused to come, when visions lingered too long, when someone stared too long at the same patch of wall and swore they saw someone standing just behind it. Wormwood was the plant of dreams and delusions, of spirits and feverish insight. The healer used it with caution. Boiled low and long with barley, it became a sleep draught that could silence the voices that rattled in a tired mind. Smoked in small curls, it could bring on visions, half memory, half mystery. Some said it opened the door to the unseen. Some said it only made you forget the lock. And yet, in the healer's hands, neither plant felt dangerous, only precise. That night, as rain gathered on the thatched rooftops, she sat with a boy who hadn't spoken in days. Fever had taken his mother, and grief had taken his voice. He wouldn't sleep, he wouldn't eat. He just sat, curled up like an empty shell. The healer said nothing. She knelt by the hearth, and lit a small pot, filled with nettle and thyme, letting the steam rise. Then she dropped in a scrap of wormwood, just enough to change the air, not to blur his mind, only to soften it. Then she wrapped the boy's feet in a poultice of crushed nettle leaves, enough sting to remind him he was still here. And as the fire crackled, and the steam wound its slow fingers around the rafters, the boy began to blink. His breath deepened, his shoulders fell, and for the first time in 3 nights, he slept. The healer did not smile, she only nodded. Then she stepped outside, barefoot again, and walked back into the night. The villagers left a bowl of oats for her by the door the next morning. She had already gone. Her kind didn't ask for gold. They asked for stories, sometimes, a meal, a blanket, a quiet place to dry herbs, and they left behind the subtle traces of care you only noticed once they were gone. A jar of salve on the windowsill, a sachet tucked into the pillow, a taste in the air you couldn't quite name. You see, the Middle Ages didn't separate magic from medicine the way we do now. The lines were blurred. One person's healing herb was another person's superstition. But for the barefoot healer, the only line that mattered was whether someone could rest when night fell. So if you ever walk alone through an old village, and you see a low trail of steam drifting from an unfamiliar window, or a bundle of herbs tied with red thread, you might be in the presence of one of them, still walking, still helping, still quiet. And maybe tonight, with the rain tapping gently at the panes, and the scent of wormwood curling around your imagination, you'll feel it too. Not fear, Not fire, just the hum of something old, soft, healing, and slowly pulling you into a better kind of sleep. The midwife's secret ointment. She was old, but no one knew how old exactly. Her back was curved like a shepherd's crook, and her voice rasped like dry leaves in autumn. The villagers called her Matthie, just Matthie, and when a birth was near, someone always ran for her. They ran through fog or snow, through dark fields or across frozen streams, clutching their breath, shouting her name, never daring to arrive without haste, because when a child needed catching, she was the one who knew what to do. Her house sat apart from the village, low to the ground, roof heavy with moss, and a yard filled with drying racks, tangled herbs and soft animal bones suspended from strings. It was not a place for play or gossip. It was a place for blood, breath, and beginnings. But Matthie had a secret, a tiny clay jar, sealed with wax, hidden beneath the hearthstone. It wasn't part of her official tools, not like the clean linens or the willow bark tea, not like the silver scissors or the carved birthing charm she always wore on a leather cord around her neck. No, this jar was only for those births that took too long, too painful, too quiet. She'd learned it from her own teacher, a woman who had once wandered in from the salt marshes with seaweed braided into her hair and secrets trapped behind her teeth. The recipe had no name. The villagers called it simply Matthie's touch. Its ingredients were ordinary enough, until they weren't. Henbane, fat, a pinch of soot, ashes from the solstice fire, and just a drop of belladonna boiled into ox milk under the full moon, mixed into a soft green ointment, with a smell like crushed nettle and rain-drenched bark. Matthie used it rarely, carefully, sparingly. When the mother's screams had faded to whispers, when the pain had turned to a blur of shadows, when even the priest was pacing, then Matthie would glance toward the hearth, cough twice, and whisper, "Warm me a cloth." She would dip her fingers into the jar, rub the ointment into the skin just below the spine, press another dob to the inside of the wrist, then fan the fumes gently toward the mother's face. Nothing happened at first. Then, her breathing deepened. Her hands stopped trembling. Her gaze went soft and distant, like someone watching clouds drift over a field. Some said the ointment called up ancient women, the ones who'd birthed children in caves, under stars, before names were invented. Others said it silenced fear long enough for life to pass through. All Matthie said was, it helps her forget the door so she can walk through it. No one argued. Sometimes the mother would murmur strange things afterward, names that didn't belong to her, or memories of silver trees and birds that spoke in riddles. But when the baby was safe and the cord was cut, no one questioned the magic. They were only grateful. The church, of course, would have called it witchcraft, dangerous, heretical. But Matthie had long since stopped listening to sermons. She knew something the priests did not. That pain could lock a woman inside her own bones, and sometimes a key was needed. In quiet hours, after the baby's cry had settled into coos and the fire had burned low, Matthie would wash her hands, seal the jar, and slip it back beneath the hearthstone. Not for every birth, she whispered once to a young girl watching her in silence, only when the veil won't lift. The girl nodded, not fully understanding, but she would, someday, and perhaps tonight, with your own breath slowing, and your mind drifting past the edge of wakefulness, you can still smell the faint traces of Matthie's ointment in the air. The memory of a secret passed from woman to woman, a healing too old for books, too soft for war, too powerful to name. In the glow of the herb fire, the cottage was barely more than a single room with a sloping roof of thatch, a door that hung slightly crooked, and smoke curling out from a chimney so old it had learned to lean with the wind. It sat at the edge of the forest, where trees whispered in the dusk, and owls watched like silent priests. Inside, the air shimmered. Not with heat, exactly, but with the warmth of something older, something cooked, brewed, and steeped 1,000 times over. In the center of the room sat the fire. Not just any fire, the herb fire. It was never allowed to die. Ashes were banked, embers coaxed, flames nudged awake before dawn. The old woman who tended it, Ilsa, though most just called her the herb wife, knew exactly which stalks and stems to toss in, which bundles to hang, when to let the smoke billow, and when to let it rise like a ribbon. Tonight, the glow was greenish, not eerie, just soft, gentle, sleepy. On the shelf above the fire were bundles tied with cord, lavender, mugwort, sage, thyme, rosemary, poppy straw, fennel, valerian root, and nettle. Each had its place, its season, and its voice in the song the fire sang. Visitors didn't always understand. They came in coughing, fretting, teeth clenched against pain or sorrow, asking for tinctures or teas, and Ilsa would nod and prepare them, but not before asking them to sit close to the fire. She'd hand them a bowl of something warm. She'd add a pinch of dried leaf or crushed seed, and then she'd wait, because in this place it was never just about the plant, it was about the breath, the letting go, the memory that your body once knew how to heal itself, if only it could remember. Children often fell asleep within minutes of sitting there, their heads drooping into their mothers' laps, as the soft smoke wound through the rafters and lulled their senses. Old men muttered into their cloaks, tears slipping down their cheeks for reasons they couldn't quite name. Even the village priest came once, though he refused to drink the tea. He stayed 2 hours anyway, silent, watching the fire, and left with eyes less clouded than before. Ilsa didn't keep written recipes, she didn't trust ink, it faded, but she trusted the way sage crumbled in her fingers after the first frost. She trusted the way valerian root stung the nose, but softened the chest. She trusted mugwort and mint to speak clearly when burned together. At night, when no one knocked, she'd sit by the fire alone, rubbing a bit of foxglove oil into her knuckles, watching the flames dance like old friends. Sometimes she whispered names to them, of those she'd helped, of those she'd lost. The fire never answered, but it listened. It always listened. Some said her fire was enchanted, that it could show visions. Others said it was dangerous, that it could bring fever dreams. Ilsa just smiled. "There are worse things than dreaming," she said once, to no one in particular. Tonight, in this soft part of the world that lives between waking and sleeping, you sit near that same fire. Maybe you feel the warmth across your knees. Maybe you smell the slow curl of rosemary and poppy in the air. Maybe you hear a whisper that sounds like your name spoken by the wind. Let it all drift, let it blur, because in this little house, on the edge of the woods, where the fire glows green and gold and drowsy, nothing is expected of you. No work, no worry, no need to explain how tired you are. Just breathe, and let the glow of the herb fire carry you away. The moonlit harvest of Nightshade. They always gathered it by moonlight, not because of any superstition. Not really, but because the day was too sharp, too busy, too full of watching eyes and wary questions. Nightshade wasn't the kind of plant you picked with idle hands and idle talk. It asked for stillness, silence, and a little bit of nerve, so they went at night. 3 women, no names, only shapes under hoods. One carried a lantern, one a basket, one nothing at all but a knife carved from bone. The meadow was quiet, steeped in silver mist. Crickets chirped like tiny hinges. An owl turned its head once, and then lost interest. There, beneath the old ash tree, was the plant, belladonna, deadly nightshade. Its leaves were deep green, waxy and wide like outstretched hands. Its berries were black and shiny, like drops of glass under the moon, and the flowers, violet, with a strange downward-tilting face, seemed to nod in agreement with every secret thought you never said aloud. The women didn't speak as they worked. The bone knife moved with slow precision, severing stem from root, leaf from stalk. The berries were gathered last, touched only with gloved fingers, and slipped into a pouch of linen lined with salt. Everything was done gently. Nightshade did not like to be startled. In folklore, belladonna was many things. A beauty enhancer for daring noblewomen, a curse ingredient for witches, a balm, a bane, a way to slip between the ribs of the world and taste something stranger. The church feared it, midwives used it, doctors argued about it, and in places like this, women harvested it beneath a waning moon, never explaining exactly why. Once picked, the plant was divided. Some went to steep in vinegar, becoming an extract so potent a drop on the tongue could dull pain for hours, or summon fevered dreams of winged horses and rivers that sang. Some was dried and crumbled for sachets, burned in rituals, or hidden in the hems of cloaks for protection. And a little, just a little, was set aside for flying ointment. Not for actual flight, of course, but for the kind of movement that leaves the body behind. Back in their cottage, lit only by embers, they would whisper over the leaves, mash the berries in a mortar of stone, stir in goose fat and hemlock resin, and seal the mixture in a clay jar with a black feather pressed into the wax. No one else saw this. No one needed to. To the village, they were herbalists, healers, strange perhaps, but tolerated, as long as no one asked too many questions. But sometimes, a girl would come knocking, wild-eyed and whispering, or a man would limp up the hill, speaking nonsense about dreams he couldn't forget, and the women would listen. They would nod, and they would not say a word about the jar that sat on the mantel, glowing faintly under the light of the moon, because nightshade was a boundary plant. It lived between medicine and poison, between fear and freedom, between the world as it is, and as it might be. And in the right hands, on the right night, it wasn't just a plant, it was a key. So tonight, as you lie still, listening to the soft turning of the world, maybe you feel that hush, that ancient silvery hush of a moonlit field. Maybe you sense the presence of those who walked barefoot into the mist, basket in hand, gathering the roots and berries that helped them forget, remember, drift and return. And maybe, just maybe, a part of you is walking with them, soft, slow, among the nightshade. The vision under the willow tree. Down by the river, where the path disappears into reeds and dragonflies dance in the golden light, there is a willow tree. Its long arms sway like curtains in a breeze that never quite arrives. Its roots are twisted, moss-covered, and sunk deep into the damp earth, as though the tree is listening, always listening, to something just beneath the soil. They say no one planted the willow. It simply arrived. One spring, there was nothing. The next, there it stood, tall, leaning slightly, and whispering to itself in a language no one could quite translate. For years, the villagers avoided it. Something about its shape, its placement, the quiet hush beneath its branches, too strange, too sacred, or maybe just too easy to believe in. But sometimes, someone would go there anyway, not for firewood, not for shade, but for the bark. Willow bark, pale, flexible, bitter to the tongue, a healer's ally, a pain's undoing. It was said to cool fevers, ease aches, and clear the mind, but only if taken right, not chewed, not boiled, no. The real trick was in slow steeping, in river water, left under moonlight. For 3 nights, only then would it be ready, soft as rain, strong as thunder. The old healer by the mill, Agnes, with the silver braid and eyes like pale ash, was the only one who truly knew how to make the willow vision brew, and she never made it twice the same way. Sometimes it was bark and rose hips, sometimes bark and crushed fennel seeds. Once, bark and a single feather from a raven that had landed on her windowsill and refused to leave. She never explained why, and no one asked. But those who drank it remembered. Not everything, just one thing, one dream, one picture, one whispered phrase that followed them through the rest of their lives. A boy saw a door in the sky. A mother saw her child before he was born. A blind man wept, claiming he'd seen light for the first time, though not with his eyes. And one girl, barely 12, fell asleep at the tree's roots and woke up saying, calmly, "The king will die in snow." No one knew what she meant, until 3 winters later when the news arrived. And the girl, now older, quieter, simply nodded. Tonight, the willow still stands. It leans just a little more than it used to. Its leaves still murmur secrets when the river is low, and if you press your ear to its bark, you may hear something soft and strange, like a sigh wrapped in wind. So here you are, beneath its branches. The air is cool, the earth is damp. You sit with your back to the tree, and your thoughts gently unspooling, like threads tugged by the hush of the water. You may not be seeking a vision, but that doesn't mean one won't come. Because in places like this, where the world forgets to rush, where leaves and dreams drift at the same speed, and where bark is medicine and roots remember, visions don't need permission. They only need quiet, so rest, breathe, and listen. The willow has something to tell you. When the fields sang and the bread turned strange, they said the fields began to hum in August. Just a low sound at first, like bees somewhere distant, or the wind dragging its fingers through barley, but then it deepened, like a song without words, rising from the earth itself. By the time the harvest came, the air was thick with it, a sound you didn't so much hear as feel, somewhere in your ribs or your teeth, or the back of your neck. It began, as these things often do, with the bread. Dark loaves, crusty and coarse, baked in village ovens by women with tired hands and flour-smudged cheeks. The same bread their mothers had made, and their mothers before that. Barley, rye, sometimes wheat, if the taxes hadn't taken too much. But this year, the loaves came out strange. First, it was the color, too dark, almost purple, in the right light. Then the texture, crumbly and slick at once. And finally, the dreams. Dreams that clung to you even after you woke. Dreams of fireflies that whispered names, of fields that folded inward like paper, of dancing, endless dancing, until the stars melted and the sun came up behind the wrong hill. Some laughed it off. A bad batch. Mold in the grain. The miller's daughter swore she'd seen mice in the flour bin. But deep down they all felt something different, something not entirely wrong, but sideways. Because after eating that bread, the villagers didn't just dream, they moved differently, sang without realizing, saw shapes in the clouds that made them weep or shiver or laugh too hard to explain. And then came the fever. Not the kind that leaves you pale in bed, but a different kind, a fever in the feet. They danced, not for joy, or love, or ritual. They danced because they couldn't stop. Old men, infants, widows, shepherds, the baker's cousin, even Father Theobald, who once condemned music as a gateway to sin, was seen stomping near the well at midnight, his arms stretched to the sky. They danced until their legs gave out, until shoes split, until tears ran down their faces, and their mouths gasped out half-formed songs in forgotten tongues. It was the grain, they whispered, rye that had turned black in the field, a strange rot, a sickness, a witch's spell, some said, God's punishment, others claimed, but a few quietly, cautiously, said it was just nature, doing what it did, when no one was watching. The monks in the next valley knew the name, ergot, a fungus, tiny, invisible, but when baked into bread, it twisted the world. Not poison, exactly, not magic either, something in between. The bread made your blood dance, made your thoughts slip sideways, made you hear music where there was none. And the fields, they still hummed. The hum turned to song, and though no one ever found a source, some swore the ground itself had begun to breathe. By autumn, the fever faded, the bread changed, but no one forgot. They still walked wide around the old rye fields, still muttered prayers at the oven, still watched each loaf with caution and reverence, because for a little while, the line between food and vision blurred, and when that happens, when the grain speaks, and the air sings, and your body becomes a vessel for something older than language, you don't forget, you wait, you listen, and maybe, just maybe, you feel it again, that slow rising rhythm, when the fields sang, and the bread turned strange. Belladonna and the Lady's Mirror. In the cold stone manor at the edge of the forest, where ivy crept through the shutters and candles were lit long before dusk, there lived a lady known for her silence. She was not unkind, nor sick, nor bitter. She simply listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was always slowly, as if drawing words up from a deep, still well. They called her Lady Rosamond. Some said she had once been a nun, others said a widow, and a few claimed she'd never been born at all, but stepped from the forest with a silver comb in one hand, and a pouch of strange seeds in the other. Whatever her past, one thing was certain. She had the mirror. A small handheld thing, not silver, not polished bronze, but black glass, smoky, cold to the touch, and older than anyone cared to guess. She would sit by the fire in her chamber, looking into it, not admiring herself, not brushing her hair, just watching. They said she saw things there, not ghosts exactly, possibilities, and always, on the table beside her, was a sprig of belladonna, also called atropa, belladonna, also called deadly nightshade. It grew wild behind the manor, purple-green leaves, delicate bell-shaped flowers, and berries that gleamed like ink, poisonous, unmistakably, but also powerful. Healers used it to dull pain, midwives kept it near, for when a birth turned hard, and women, those with knowledge, or desperation, sometimes took it in drops, carefully measured, to bring stillness to a stormy mind, or to see differently, not with the eyes, but with something deeper, a kind of second sight that bloomed only in stillness, and sometimes, only with help. Lady Rosamond's tincture was said to be special, not boiled, not soaked, distilled, with water drawn from a well that hadn't gone dry in 300 years, and steeped with mint, to soothe the tongue. 1 drop, under the tongue. 2, if the night was especially long, and always with the mirror. She would sit, the flames would flicker, and in the silence, she would see, a night riding into fog, a child laughing beneath a tree that hadn't grown yet, a crow landing on a cross, its wings tipped in frost. They were visions, but not prophecies, glimpses, whispers, like echoes from the edge of sleep. Of course no one believed her, except those who came in secret, a merchant who'd lost his wife, a servant girl with questions she couldn't speak aloud, a priest, shaking, who asked only to look, not into the mirror, but into her eyes, and still she said nothing. She just gave them tea, bitter and warm, let them sit in silence, and watched the mirror. Belladonna is a cruel plant. Too much and the heart races, the mouth dries, the world spins, but just enough, just barely enough. It parts the veil, and for a moment, you are both here and not here. In the manor, the mirror remains. Lady Rosamond is long gone, but her chair still faces the hearth. The belladonna still grows wild in the garden, and some say that on certain nights, when the moon is heavy and the air feels like velvet, you can still see a woman's reflection in the glass, though no one is holding it. And if you look closely, her lips move, slowly, like they always did. But no one has ever quite made out what she says. Maybe you will, if you're still, if you're ready, if you're not afraid of the dark glass and the berry's shadow. Look. A whisper from the walled garden. There was a garden in the south corner of the priory, hidden behind thick stone walls mottled with moss and thyme. It had no proper gate, no clear path, and no reason for most to enter. The novices avoided it. The abbot pretended it wasn't there. But someone always kept it tended. The herbs inside weren't like the kitchen's tidy beds of parsley and sage. These plants leaned strange, reached sideways, slept under thorny shadows, and bloomed only when the moon was right. The garden smelled of damp earth and old secrets, of things too bitter to cook, too sacred to name aloud. They said the garden had been planted by Sister Benedicta, a woman who never raised her voice, and who, it was whispered, could quiet a fever with only a poultice and a prayer. She died decades ago, they said, but the garden remained, and sometimes, just before matins, a novice walking by would hear a sound, not wind, not birds, but words faint, winding through the leaves like smoke. A whisper. Inside the garden, nothing grew by accident. There was rue, sharp and cleansing, vervain for dreams, betony for protection, and monkshood, tall, blue, deadly, swaying as if it knew. In the center, under the shade of an ash tree, grew the herb of sleep, valerian. Its roots were knotted like knuckles, its flowers pale and soft as breath. When crushed, they released a smell, some found sweet, others revolting. But all agreed on what it did. It quieted the world, slowed the pulse, stilled the thoughts that chased each other round and round through the mind. The garden was not locked, it simply waited for the right hands. Sister Margot found it during a winter of restless nights. The other nuns said she talked in her sleep, reciting psalms that didn't exist, or laughing at something no one else could see. She'd begun to forget names, words, even her prayers slipped sideways. One dawn she wandered through the snow, drawn by a scent that reminded her of childhood, warm earth, dry leaves, her mother's hands. The walled garden let her in. She stayed for hours, returned the next day, and the next. No one asked where she went, but she began to sleep again. And when she spoke, it was slower, softer, but clearer somehow, like her voice had been washed. She learned each plant, not from a book, but from listening, because that was the secret. The plants whispered, not in words, exactly, but in impressions. A pull here, a chill there, a warmth that bloomed in the chest when you brushed against certain leaves. One morning, Margot brewed a tea from valerian, linden, and a pinch of crushed chamomile. She sat by the ash tree, sipped slowly, and felt the garden settle around her like a cloak. She saw just for a moment the shape of Sister Benedicta in the leaves, smiling. And from that day on, Margot began to tend the garden in silence, not because she had to, but because the whisper asked her to, and in return it gave her sleep, and peace, and on the gentlest nights, dreams that bloomed like valerian in the dark. The peasant who danced with no music. They say he danced for 3 days without stopping. No drumbeat guided him, no flute led him, just his bare feet in the dust, and a look in his eyes that made even the priest step back and cross himself. They called him Jorund, though that might not have been his name. Some claimed he'd been born during a lightning storm. Others said he wandered in from the hills, barefoot and smiling, with nothing but a pouch of dried herbs and a spindle of red thread. No one really knew, but everyone remembered the dance. It began in late summer, when the wheat stood tall and heavy with sun. The village had gathered for the harvest blessing, a time for hymns, ale, and laughter. Jorund arrived late, just as the last cup was being passed, and the children began to chase shadows between the carts. He said nothing, only looked at the sky, then down at the earth, then began to move. Not wildly, not like a drunkard, but slowly, steadily, like someone hearing something faint and far away, a rhythm no one else could catch. At first they laughed. A few clapped, one man grabbed a stick and beat it like a drum. But Joran didn't change pace. He moved through the square like smoke, graceful, unbothered. Eyes open but far off, as though watching a fire no one else could see. Then the sun went down, and he kept dancing. Someone offered him food. He didn't take it. A jug of watered wine was pressed into his hands. He poured a drop on the ground and kept going. By the second day, the laughter had faded. Children watched from doorways, the priest frowned from behind his candles, and still Joran danced, his skin streaked with dust, his breath slow, eyes still listening to something no one else could hear. Old Marta, the herb wife, said she knew what it was, not madness, not possession, but a root she hadn't seen since her youth. She named it with care, St. John's taper, devil's weed, and white fool's blood. A plant that grew high on the moor, dry and bitter, gathered only when the moon was right, brewed into a thin golden tea with a single thorn from a hawthorn tree. It didn't bring visions, exactly. It untied knots, the ones wound too tightly in the mind, the ones that made you weep without reason, or stare at a wall for days. Joran, she guessed, had drunk too deeply of it, or perhaps, just enough. By the third night, the villagers didn't try to stop him. They laid hay in the square so his feet wouldn't bleed. Someone hung a lantern from the church door, so he wouldn't dance in darkness, and old Marta placed sprigs of rue and mugwort at the corners of the square to keep his spirit anchored. At dawn on the fourth day, Joran stopped. He stood still for the first time, hands open, head bowed, and then he laughed. Not wildly and not like a fool, just gently, like someone waking from a strange but peaceful dream. He said nothing, took no food, just walked to the edge of the village, turned once smiling, and vanished into the fields. No one saw him again, but the village remembered, and each year, just before harvest, they laid fresh rue and mugwort in the square, not out of fear, but gratitude, because for a little while, someone had danced with no music, and reminded them that even in a world of stone and rules, there were still rhythms you couldn't name, only feel. Oils, ashes, and the memory of flight. There were stories whispered near the hearth, when the fire had burned low, and even the boldest drinkers began to yawn. Stories not told in the light of day, about women with stained fingers, men who walked alone at night, and ointments that left strange patterns on the skin. No one remembered who first called it flight. It wasn't the kind with wings or wind. Not really, but something happened, something real enough, that when the village hound began howling at nothing, a few of the old ones would glance toward the forest, and murmur prayers under their breath. It always began with the oil, thick, dark, infused with herbs you weren't supposed to grow in neat rows. Belladonna, henbane, datura, plants whose names were kept tucked between the pages of forbidden herbals. The oil was prepared in secret, steeped in fat rendered over low flames, and stirred until it shimmered like moonlight in a bowl of ink, and then it was applied. Not drunk, never drunk. That was a mistake made only once. No, it was smeared onto the wrists, the temples, the thighs, anywhere the skin was thin, and the blood ran close to the surface. They said warmth spread from those places. First a gentle hum, then a slow unspooling, like a spool of thread being drawn through the body, loosening everything it touched. The world didn't vanish. It stretched. A fire became a constellation. The dog's bark turned to song, and the earth fell away. They said it felt like flying, but not like birds, more like drifting over the roof of your own cottage, seeing your thatch from above, the fields beyond the woodpile, the lantern glow from the alehouse, the slow, steady breathing of someone you loved, curled under a sheepskin by the hearth. Sometimes the visions were strange. Forests turned silver, stars whispered secrets, dead uncles gave confusing advice about carrots, but there was always a thread, an invisible line that pulled you back to your body, soft as smoke, sure as gravity, and when you returned your hands smelled of ash and thyme. The morning after was always quiet. The world didn't look the same, not better, not worse, just deeper, as if the hills had edges you'd never noticed before, and even the chickens had something ancient in their eyes. Of course, such things weren't discussed openly. The church said flight was impossible, unless granted by God. Anything else was illusion, or sin, or both. But the women in the hills still kept jars in their cupboards. The old men still muttered about dreams that didn't feel like dreams, and the woods still smelled, now and then, of strange oils and warm ash. If you asked one of them, very gently, they wouldn't confirm anything, but they might look at you for a long moment, smile faintly, and ask, "Do you remember what it felt like, right before you woke up?" The sleep of the candlemaker's son. He slept for 2 days and 3 nights, and when he woke he could name all the saints in order, from memory, and with the calm certainty of someone who had spoken to them personally. At least, that's what they said, in the village. His name was Elric, the candlemaker's son, a quiet boy with wide eyes, hair that smelled always of beeswax, and fingers burned so often they'd stopped blistering. He knew how to dip wicks without spilling a drop, how to trim a taper so it wouldn't smoke, and how to count hours by how far the wax had melted. He wasn't sickly, not especially strange, but he had a habit of listening too closely to things no one else heard: the wind in the shutters, the pop of pine in the fire, the whisper of an herb as it was crushed in a mortar. The candlemaker, his father, was a practical man. Wax was for prayer, not dreams. But Elric watched the flame, always the flame, as though waiting for it to speak. One day, a travelling apothecary passed through. She sold salves and powders, spoke in low tones, and smelled of rosemary and old leather. Elric lingered by her cart, drawn to the little blue vial resting quietly among the bags of dried petals and resin. She saw him, held the vial up, said nothing, but her eyes twinkled, and Elric reached for it. It was labelled only with a symbol, a single flame. That night, while the village snored and the church bells dreamed of Sunday, Elric sat alone in the workshop, a taper lit before him, and the vial uncorked. Inside, a thick oil shimmered, fragrant with poppy, valerian, and something older, sharper, like crushed lavender steeped in thunder. He touched it to his temples, his wrists, and then, to the center of his brow. Then he slept, and slept, and slept. His father found him curled on the bench, his chest rising and falling, like the slow swing of an incense censer, a faint smile on his lips, and the flame of the candle, untouched, still dancing. They tried to wake him, they tried everything. The priest read psalms, the healer burned sage, the neighbors whispered, but Elric slept on, calm and unmoved, as if floating gently on some quiet tide beyond reach. On the third morning, just as the dew began to lift from the fields, his eyes opened. He sat up slowly, looked at the flickering candle, and whispered, "I saw the wax melt backward." He never explained what that meant, but he walked with more purpose after that, spoke more slowly, laughed more easily, and began to craft candles unlike any the village had seen. They burned blue, they didn't smoke, and if you sat near one long enough, you began to remember dreams you hadn't had yet. No one could explain it, but the apothecary never returned, and Elric never again touched the vial. He didn't need to. He had learned, somehow, how to trap sleep in wax, and to share a little of that sleep with anyone willing to sit quietly and simply watch the flame. A prayer, a root, and a very long nap. They found her kneeling in the chapel garden, hands folded neatly over a patch of soft, disturbed earth. At first they thought she was praying. Her shoulders were relaxed, her head bowed, and the morning breeze played gently with the hem of her veil. The dew hadn't touched her robes, though, and the candle she'd lit beside her had long since burned to nothing. There was a faint smell in the air, earthy, bittersweet, and oddly calming, like dried roses pressed between pages of old parchment. But she wasn't praying, not anymore. She was asleep. Her name was Sister Annika, and she tended the herbs behind the convent walls. Not the fancy flowers or tidy rows of mint and chive the abbess showed visitors, but the forgotten corner past the beehives, where the roots ran deep and the labels had faded. It was there that the stranger's gift had been planted, a root with a name too long in a language no one spoke, given in thanks for a kindness Annika had already forgotten. She had asked no questions, only found a spot, knelt down and whispered a prayer. That night, she brewed a tea, only a little, just a taste, enough to ease the ache behind her eyes, the weight in her bones, the years she rarely spoke of. And then she knelt, as she always did, to offer her evening prayers, and drifted into sleep. Not the restless kind that tugs at your edges, not the dreamless kind that passes too quickly, but the kind of sleep that reaches backwards down the bones, through the blood, and into the roots of things. A sleep that remembers. She saw her mother's garden, the one with the leaning fig tree. She heard her brother's laugh, the one lost to fever in a winter she never spoke of. She smelled the wind on a road she'd never taken, but somehow knew, and far beneath all of it, she heard the root hum. The sisters left her be. For 2 full days, no one disturbed her, not out of fear, but out of something older, respect, wonder, as though the garden had asked for silence, and they had simply obeyed. When she woke, the The teacup was still beside her, cold, and the candle, though long gone, had left behind a trail of wax shaped like a spiral. She rose slowly and returned to her work. But after that, the garden changed. New shoots grew where none had been planted. Visitors said the air felt warmer, softer, as if someone had just smiled at them. And no one, not once, ever saw Sister Annika rush again. She moved with the memory of rest, with roots in her blood, and a prayer still humming just beneath her breath. The potion found in a hollow book. It was the sort of book no one read anymore. Its binding was cracked, its pages swollen from centuries of damp air, and the script inside was faded almost to silence. It lived on the third shelf from the bottom, in the monastery library, behind the pewter hourglass, and beside a scroll that no longer unrolled. No one remembered placing it there, no one remembered why it had never been catalogued. But Brother Mattis found it anyway. Not on purpose, of course. He had been searching for a sermon on fasting, and fell asleep halfway through the second paragraph. When he woke, still seated at the heavy oak table, ink smudged on his sleeve, he noticed something strange, a glint of glass, catching the lantern light between the pages. The book was heavier than it should have been, thicker, too. When he opened it, he found the middle cut away, hollowed like a chest, perfectly shaped to cradle the small dark vial resting inside. It had no label, just a red thread tied around the neck. Mattis had never broken a rule in his life. He copied manuscripts, lit candles, fed the cats, and walked the cloister in perfect rhythm with the bell tower. But this was something else. He uncorked it without thinking. The smell was deep and herbal, with notes of damp bark and something faintly metallic, like old silver left out in the rain. He barely touched a drop to his tongue, and the world shifted. The wooden beams above him breathed. The candlelight bent and curled into shapes he'd only seen in dreams. The words on the pages began to rearrange themselves, not into madness, but into music. Clear, orderly, strangely comforting. Like someone was reading to him from just behind his shoulder, in a voice he'd known all his life, though couldn't name. He slept, though he didn't remember lying down. And when he woke, the book had closed itself. The vial was gone, and in its place, a single pressed petal, violet, paper-thin, still fragrant despite the centuries. He never found the book again. Others searched, the monks even rearranged the entire shelf. But it had vanished. Brother Mattis didn't mind. After that, his eyes softened. He sang more often during Vespers. His hands no longer trembled when copying difficult scripts. And every so often, when alone, he would close his eyes and smile, as if hearing that music again, distant but never forgotten. And deep in the stacks, where the dust never quite settled, some said they sometimes smelled violet and rain, as if the book was still there, watching, waiting. Smoke trails in the witch's orchard. No one called her a witch to her face, not because they feared her, but because deep down, they didn't want to be wrong. Her orchard sat at the very edge of the village, where the soil grew dark and soft underfoot, and the wind always carried the smell of something brewing. It wasn't large, just a scatter of crooked trees, most of them fruitless, their bark gnarled like knuckles, and their branches draped with strips of linen, bones, and dried orange peel. No fences, no paths, just the orchard, and the thin trails of smoke that curled up from it, no matter the hour. The woman who tended it went by many names, none of them hers. Some said she was older than the chapel. Others said she'd arrived on the same cart that carried a fever out of the north. All agreed she never asked for coin, only favors, small ones, a candle lit, a pot stirred, a name remembered. And when someone came knocking, head bowed, voice shaking, it was almost always the smoke that answered first. Not choking or sharp, but soft, curling, sweet and sharp at once, like bruised apples in a wooden bowl beside a fire. They said she could brew sleep like soup. Once a soldier returned from war, eyes glassy, dreams torn by things he wouldn't name. She gave him a leaf wrapped in cloth, and told him to burn it slowly in the room where he slept. For 3 nights he wept without waking. On the 4th, he laughed, just once, but it was enough. Another time, a farmer's wife miscarried in spring. Her hands shook, and her breath caught in her throat for days. The orchard woman handed her a tincture that smelled of pine and sorrow. Afterward she slept 3 days in a row, and woke with a song on her lips she didn't remember learning. They say the smoke knew what you needed, before you spoke it aloud. But the orchard had rules. No shouting, no fire, no iron, and never, under any circumstance, should you try to take a cutting from the trees. They weren't ordinary trees. Their leaves shimmered strangely at dusk. Some bloomed in winter, some bore fruit that buzzed faintly when held too long, and in the moonlight, the bark of the oldest tree pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Children dared one another to run through the orchard after sundown. Most came back quiet. One boy came back with silver dust in his hair, and forgot how to speak for a week. Another swore he saw his grandmother smiling from inside one of the apples. The woman never explained, she only tended. She stirred her pots, hung her charms, and let the smoke rise. It didn't spread, it stayed low and close, like a shawl pulled tight over old shoulders. And some nights, if the wind was just right, villagers would pause at their windows and inhale, not out of fear, but out of memory, the kind that lives in your lungs for years without ever quite leaving. The stranger who knew every herb by name, he came just after the frost broke, when the last patches of snow clung to the hollows beneath hedgerows, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and moss. No one saw his cart arrive. There was no sound of hooves or wheels. But by dawn he was sitting at the edge of the market square, with a linen bundle on his lap, and a sprig of rosemary tucked behind one ear. He wasn't old, not quite, but his beard had begun to silver, and the lines on his face looked more like river paths than age. His eyes were the color of dried bay leaves, dull until the light hit them just right. Then they gleamed, as though lit from beneath. The villagers didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't selling anything, just watching, listening. When the baker's boy scraped his knee near the fountain, the man whistled softly and pulled a leaf from his pocket. "Crush this. Press it here," he said, as if reciting something remembered, not taught. The boys stopped crying before the pigeons did. By noon a crowd had gathered, curious, cautious, drawn in like smoke curling toward a chimney. He spoke very little, but when someone pointed to a leaf or a sprig or a withered stem from the apothecary's discarded sweepings, he named it. Not just its name, but its mood, its season, what it liked to grow near, what sort of sleep it gave, or what kind of dreams. "This one," he said once, tapping a pale green shoot, "is for travelers too long from home. It tastes like warm bread if you chew it before bed." He carried no books, only memory. By the third day the village physician came to test him, held up a dried root with no leaves, no bloom. "Tell me this," he said, skeptically. The stranger smiled. "Angelica archangelica, grown in clay soil pulled too soon. It would have calmed the lungs more, had you waited until the moon began to wane." He didn't smile to be clever, just to be certain. Children began leaving petals on the stone where he sat. One little girl asked if he had a plant for nightmares. He gave her a twist of cloth with something soft smelling inside. "Put it beneath your pillow," he said, "and if the dream comes again, ask it what it wants. Some dreams are just waiting to be spoken to." That night, the girl slept soundly for the first time in months. But by the end of the week, the stranger was gone. The stone was bare. No bundle, no footprints, only a faint indentation where he had sat, and beside it, one perfect, blooming flower that none of the villagers could name, not even the apothecary. It never wilted, not through storm, not through frost. Some say it's still there, and sometimes, when the wind turns strange, the children say they can smell rosemary on the breeze, and the baker's boy swears his old scar doesn't ache as much. Just a whisper of healing, left behind by the stranger who knew every herb by name. A fever dream beneath the cathedral. The cathedral had stood for more than 200 years, but the stone beneath it had been quiet for far longer. Before prayers echoed in Latin, before incense drifted through the nave, before even the first bell was cast. That ground had stories in it, soft ones, buried deep, and that was where they took him. When the fever came, he was a scribe, pale and hunched from years of ink and scripture. They said he collapsed mid-psalm, his quill slipping from fingers that had never known a sword, only vellum. The heat of the fever burned him from the inside, and no poultice, prayer, or physician's remedy could cool it. So the monks did what monks did when medicine failed. They carried him to the crypt, not out of fear, out of hope. The old crypt, sealed to the public, lay just beneath the western transept, cool, damp and strangely still. They placed him on a stone slab near the oldest wall, where even the mortar had forgotten its name. There, they burned thyme, lavender, and sage in a small clay bowl. Not to heal him, they said, but to keep the dreams gentle, because sometimes the monks believed fever could burn a hole in the veil between worlds, and that's where his mind went. The scribe dreamed of voices, not whispering, not shouting, singing. Low, slow chants in no tongue he had ever copied. He dreamed of vines curling along the floor, of stone melting like wax. He saw a figure robed in roots, face hidden, reaching out a hand wrapped in ivy. "Write this down," the figure said. He had no pen, only his finger. He wrote across the stone, lines of golden script unspooled from his fingertips, floating, glowing, pulsing like breath. He wrote of herbs no longer known, of brews that could stop grief mid-sentence, of roots that grew only in the dream of a dying tree. When he woke, because he did, the fever was gone. So was the bowl of herbs, so were the monks who had carried him. He was alone, except the stone at his side was covered in faint, curling script, not Latin, not Greek, not anything the cathedral scholars could identify. It shimmered faintly in candlelight, like something remembered from a long time ago. They sealed the crypt again, not out of fear, out of respect. The scribe lived quietly after that, never fell ill again. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk barefoot through the cloisters and pause by the incense brazier. He never said what he'd seen. Only once did someone ask him what he'd written, and the scribe simply smiled and said, "Not all stories need to be read, some are meant to be felt." The Barefoot Doctor and the Brew of Thorns. They called her the Barefoot Doctor, though no one quite knew if she had ever studied in a place with scrolls or seals or saints. She walked the village paths in silence, toes dusted with earth, her cloak stitched from scraps of wool the color of dusk. Her hair, always loose, held the scent of pine smoke and crushed elderflowers. Children were the first to trust her. Animals too. Old women called her wise. The priest said nothing at all. She never knocked on doors. She arrived when she was needed, just before the baby turned, or the wound soured, or the grief settled in a room like damp. She carried no bag, no books, only a little kettle, a leather pouch of roots, and a ring of dried thorns tied with twine. The thorns were curious, each blackened and polished smooth, each from a different hedgerow, or holy place. Some said they were a charm, others said they were the key to her most powerful brew. The brew of thorns, they whispered. It wasn't a tea, exactly, and it wasn't a tonic. It was something in between, a drink for those who couldn't sleep, couldn't stop weeping, or couldn't stop seeing the face of a brother lost in the last harvest plague. It worked slowly, like rain softening stone. First the fingers relaxed, then the thoughts, then the heart. Then, if you were lucky, a dream would come, soft and green and full of sunlight. No one who drank the brew of thorns remembered it fully, only that they woke lighter, as if something had been lifted, but not all could take it. The doctor would test them first. She'd place a thorn on the tongue. If it tasted like honey, they were ready. If it burned, they were not. It was not a cure. It was a letting go. The only story ever told about her own past came from an old shepherd who swore he'd known her as a girl. He said her brother had once been taken by a fever dream and never returned, that she'd wandered into the woods barefoot, searching for a plant that grew only in moonlight and sorrow, that when she came back she didn't speak for a year, but her eyes never stopped watching. No one dared ask her directly. One winter, when the snow was high and silence ruled the lanes, she disappeared. Her little hut, tucked behind the withy trees, was empty. The ashes in the hearth, cold, the ring of thorns still hung from the beam. No footprints, no signs of struggle, only a cup on the table, still warm, half full of a dark amber liquid that smelled faintly of pine, grief and distant spring. Some say she drank her own brew at last. Some say she walked barefoot into the woods one final time to meet someone she'd been waiting for. And some say, if you listen on a frost-heavy morning, you can hear the gentle clink of dried thorns swaying on the wind as the barefoot doctor walks just out of sight. Quiet madness in the village square. It began with humming. Not a song anyone recognized, just a soft, tuneless hum that drifted across the square one late summer morning, as if carried on the breath of the heat itself. It came from the old cooper, a man known for his silence, who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since the day his workshop burned down in the spring rains. Now, he was humming and smiling and walking slowly in circles, barefoot on the warm stones of the square. At first, the villagers watched from doorways with mild concern. Then came the laughter, gentle, harmless, strange. He spoke to the air, as if listening to a friend beside him. then to the old tree at the square's edge, bowing formally, then to the sky, with both arms raised as if catching invisible rain. A baker's boy whispered, "He's caught the mad sleep." The term was old, older than the cobbles underfoot, a kind of waking dream that settled on the village every few years, never predictable. Some blamed mouldy rye, others spoke of a curse passed through shared bread, the more pious called it divine punishment. The herbalists meanwhile looked carefully at the colour of the wild fungi blooming near the well. By sunset 4 others had joined the cooper. The weaver's apprentice was spinning thread that wasn't there. The miller's wife recited poetry in a language no one had taught her. The stable hand danced slowly, eyes closed as if following music only he could hear. And yet, no one was afraid. There was no violence, no screams, only a strange, quiet joy, like a secret had passed through them all, like they were remembering something forgotten. The priest tried to intervene, incense swinging, prayers shouted, holy water flung in arcs across the stone. Nothing changed. The cooper simply kissed the priest's hand and went back to his circles. Then, as quietly as it began, the madness faded. Each returned to themselves in their own time, blinking, tired, confused, but unharmed. No memory of what they'd said or seen, just a sense of calm, like they'd walked a long way and returned, changed in ways they could not explain. Only one thing lingered. The old tree in the village square, the one the cooper had bowed to, began to bloom out of season. Small white blossoms, fragrant and soft, even as autumn crept in. No one dared cut a branch. In later years they'd call it the blooming madness. But in that first quiet summer, they just called it the day the veil thinned, and something older passed through them all like mist. And for weeks afterward, if you stood alone in the square just before dawn, you might hear humming, soft, tuneless and strangely kind. The owl watched the herbalist work. The village owl had no name, though some called it Mistcloak for the way it appeared, only when the fog rolled low and the trees grew quiet. It never hooted, only watched, perched solemnly on the beam above the herbalist's cottage, its eyes twin lanterns in the dusk. The herbalist never acknowledged it, not directly. He was a quiet man, older than most thought. His beard grew in uneven patches, streaked with green from handling too many nettles, and his hands smelled always of thyme and something more peculiar, perhaps poppy sap, or the resin scraped from an ancient tree outside the church grounds. By day he treated aches and fevers. By night he worked on things no one asked about. There were jars on his shelf with no labels, just symbols scratched in wax, tiny bottles that glowed faintly when held to candlelight, and scrolls written in an ink that faded if read too quickly. Sometimes he'd grind a powder so fine it floated like smoke, then breathe it in through a hollow reed while staring into a bowl of still water for hours. The owl always came for that. It never blinked, just watched, head cocked, feathers unmoving. A quiet sentinel. Villagers whispered that the bird was a spirit, or worse, a spy. But the herbalist only smiled when asked, then offered tea with too many herbs to name. It always tasted different. Sometimes it made your dreams vivid, sometimes it made your sadness lighter. Once, it made a widow speak to her husband in her sleep, and she woke smiling for the first time in a decade. Still, the owl never left. It was there when the herbalist found the frost flower blooming out of season. There when he planted something deep under the hearth and watered it with snowmelt and murmured words. There when he pressed oil into a dying boy's chest and told him, softly, "This is not your day." No one knew what the owl saw. But once, on a windless night, the herbalist looked up from his notes and finally spoke aloud to it. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" The owl did not reply, "But not as long as I have." And then he laughed, not kindly, but not cruelly either, just a little sad, a little tired. The owl stretched its wings and drifted silently into the night. The next morning, the herbalist's door was closed, though no one remembered closing it. A faint scent of burnt rosemary lingered on the wind, and above the doorway, a single white feather had been pinned with a sprig of mugwort. He didn't open again for many days, but when he did, the tea he offered tasted like winter, and the silence in his eyes had deepened just slightly, like a well that had been drawn from one time too many. And still, each foggy evening, the owl returned. A soup that sang in Latin. It started as many things do, with a simmer. The kitchen behind the abbey had been cold for days. The cook away in the next town to fetch barley and smoked eel. Only the novice remained behind, barely more than a boy, with a soft voice and a habit of stirring things too long. His name was Toma, though few remembered it. He didn't mean to make anything unusual, just a broth for the sick monk upstairs. A simple thing, garlic, leeks, a root he found tucked in a jar marked only with a faded cross, and a pinch of green powder wrapped in an old prayer ribbon. He stirred it slowly, humming under his breath, as snow began to fall beyond the narrow window. And as the bubbles rose, so too did a voice, very faint, just above the broth. Not a whisper, not a whistle, a chant, in Latin. Not harsh or commanding, but soft, like the echo of a hymn long forgotten. The kind sung under breath, while scrubbing stone floors, familiar, but not known. Toma froze. The soup kept singing. The words were strange but felt warm, like a blessing carried in steam. He tasted it, not because he was hungry, but because something old in him said, "This is yours." What followed was not sleep, but not quite waking either. The candlelight turned golden. The shadows stretched tall and slow. The walls seemed to lean closer, and the air tasted of honey and cold iron. Toma saw his mother, long past, standing by the hearth. She didn't speak, just nodded once, as if to say, "You've done well." When he blinked again, the pot was boiling over. He cleaned in silence, hands trembling. Later he brought the soup to the sick monk, who drank deeply and sighed as though remembering a favorite childhood song. By morning, the monk rose from bed for the first time in weeks, whispering psalms with new breath. Toma never found the green powder again. The jar was gone, the ribbon too, but the old kitchen sometimes remembered. When the snow was heavy, and the night was still, pots left unattended would begin to hum, softly, faintly, in Latin. Not all heard it, but those who did, said it felt like a memory wrapped in warmth, a hymn made of broth, roots, and something more. The Queen's sleep, and the bitter syrup. They said the Queen had not spoken in 3 days. She lay in her chambers beneath curtains woven with silver thread, unmoving but not gone. Her breath came soft and slow, like wind over parchment, and her hands remained folded across her chest, still pale, but not cold. Physicians came and went, their tools jangling like small bells, but none dared wake her, not with what she'd drunk. It was syrup, dark as ink, and poured from a vial, no larger than a sparrow's egg. A gift, they said, from a travelling healer, who claimed descent from Moorish scholars and forest witches alike. He'd come quietly, without escort, wearing a cloak stitched with tiny bones no larger than seeds. He said the Queen needed rest deeper than sleep, and so she drank. The syrup was thick and bitter, brewed from bark and resin and petals that bloomed only beneath eclipsed moons. It smelled of burned sugar and dried flowers, of something too old to name. Her face softened as she swallowed, as if a long ache had sighed and slipped from her bones. Then she closed her eyes. That was 3 nights past. By day, her ladies whispered. By night, they lit candles that flickered strangely, as if wind moved where no doors were open. No one dared disturb the Queen, not for fear of death, but of waking something too peaceful to interrupt. And still, her sleep deepened. Some said she wandered gardens beneath the earth, where the roses bloomed black and the birds spoke prophecy. Others believed she had been invited to the table of the dead, sipping wine with ancestors who sang in a forgotten tongue. The syrup was gone, the healer too. But by the 4th day the Queen smiled in her sleep, a real gentle smile, as though remembering the name of something once loved and lost. She woke with the sunrise, not suddenly but slowly, as though the veil between dreams and waking had softened into mist. When she spoke, her first words were not of pain or hunger. She said, simply, "I saw the forest where time grows sideways," and though she never spoke of the syrup again, she often asked for bitter tea before sleep, and sat in her garden longer than before, quiet, content, and strangely timeless. The herb that erased time. It was said to grow only where clocks refused to work. Not that many people had clocks in 1347, of course, but time still passed, and they still felt it, in aching backs, in the way bread rose slower on cold mornings, and in the shadows that crept across chapel walls. But there was a valley, tucked far behind a crumbling abbey, where time itself seemed to slip. Shepherds avoided it, travellers forgot it, and yet one herb thrived there. Its leaves were shaped like soft, crooked stars. Its smell was sweet, almost too sweet, like honey left in the sun, or memories that don't quite belong to you. The locals didn't have a name for it. They just called it the forgetting leaf. No one grew it on purpose. It could not be cultivated, only found, sometimes tucked between stones, or curled against the base of an old tree. It shimmered faintly in moonlight, as if touched by dew that hadn't fallen yet. Old midwives warned against it. "You'll forget your own name," they'd whisper. "Or worse, remember something that hasn't happened yet." But some sought it anyway. A soldier returned from war once, his hands trembling, his eyes far away. He found the herb at dusk, brewed it into tea with wild mint and a dash of vinegar. The next morning, he sat by the fire smiling, unable to recall the names of battles or the color of blood. He wept, but with relief. A widow drank it, hoping to forget her husband's face. She forgot her own age instead. For the next 2 months she wandered like a girl of 15, giggling, gathering flowers, twirling in the market square. Then, one day her memory returned, like a wave, gentle and crashing all at once. She cried only once, then lived quietly ever after, folding herbs with quiet hands, and a monk long ago sipped it once in solitude. He wrote of what he saw, a place with no beginning or end, where bells tolled without sound, and stars blinked like candle flames held in cupped hands. "I saw the shape of forever," he wrote, "and it was very soft. The herb was never forbidden. It was never written into law, nor hoarded by kings or priests. It simply grew where time bent, and those who found it were never quite the same again. Gentler, perhaps slower in step, with eyes that seem to listen more than see. Some say it still grows, not everywhere, just where it's needed. You don't find it by searching, you find it by standing still, until the world around you stops remembering what day it is." The Lost Library of Smells and Spells. They say there was once a library that no one could read by sight alone. It wasn't built of paper, or bound in leather. It didn't have ink, nor shelves labeled with Latin tags. It lived beneath an apothecary's shop in a forgotten part of a market town, just past the candlemaker's stall, and down a crooked alley that always seemed to lean a little more than the rest. The library was small, just one room, no windows. The walls were made of stone and moss, the floor soft with dried petals and woven straw mats. But what it held was scent. Dozens of stoppered vials lined the low, warped shelves, jars, bowls, flasks, some clear, some cloudy with time. There was no catalogue, no scribbled inventory, only a woman, older than most remembered, who sat cross-legged by the fire, with a small brass spoon and a bundle of dried herbs on her lap. To enter the library was to inhale history. You didn't find knowledge there by reading, you found it by breathing. There was a vial that held the smell of wild rain after a funeral, soaked soil, rosemary, and the sadness of lilies wilting too fast. One sniff and memories would surface, not always your own. Another smelled of midnight ink and crushed lavender, said to help monks who copied scripture forget the cold in their fingers. One smelled like laughter in summer, a blend of honeyed mead, sun-warmed hay, and something like peaches left too long on the branch. The old woman never explained them. "Some libraries are read," she'd say softly. "This one is remembered." People came to her quietly, a midwife with shaking hands, a traveling friar with eyes too old for his face, a weaver whose dreams no longer visited her at night. The woman would listen without interruption, then walk the room, running fingers across the glass, stopping now and then to hum, a melody so low it barely stirred the air. She'd hand over a vial and wait, and then, you'd smell it, and something inside would settle. Some said the scents were brewed with herbs found only under moonlight. Others believed they were memories pressed from dreams, extracted like oils from the subconscious. A few accused her of witchcraft, but they never stayed long. Those who lingered were not looking to accuse. They were looking to remember, or to forget, just for a little while. No one knew how long the library had existed. It wasn't always there, people said. Some found it once and never again. Others lived next door, and never knew it was beneath their feet. One winter, it vanished. The apothecary's shop above it burned in a slow, quiet fire that left only ash and the faint scent of rosemary in the snow. There was no body, no glass, only a melted brass spoon curled like a question mark. But for months afterward, those who had visited the library claimed they still caught whiffs of those strange healing scents in their scarves, in closed drawers, in the folds of winter blankets, like the memory of memory itself. Healers of the hollow hill and the roots that remembered. There was a hill not far from the old Roman road, so ordinary by daylight, so forgettable that most maps never bothered to name it. But under twilight, when the last sheep was herded home and the mist rolled in like breath from the deep earth, the hill changed. It was said that if you pressed your ear to the moss near the crooked hawthorn tree at its crown, you might hear whispering, not of wind or creatures, but something older, something root-deep. Locals called it the Hollow Hill. They said it remembered things. Not in the way people do. Not with stories or names or dates. But in smells and moisture, and the slow curling of roots toward warmth. It remembered when the Romans marched past in sandals. It remembered when wolves used to sing on the ridges at dusk. And it remembered the women who once knelt at its base and dug quietly with flat stones. The healers, they didn't call themselves witches, they didn't call themselves anything, but they lived in the trees and hedgerows, in mossy huts with bundles of herbs drying from the rafters and bowls of mushroom caps sorted by moon phase. Their tools were simple, a sharp blade for bark, a clay pot for boiling, a finger pressed gently to the pulse of a wrist. The Hollow Hill was their garden. Roots there grew crooked and strong, twisted by something in the soil. Mandrake, with limbs like dolls. Henbane with leaves that quivered without wind. Vervain, foxglove, and black poppy, all blooming just a little too early, or too late, or not at all until someone sang softly beside them. But the strangest root of all was the memory root. It had no official name. It wasn't listed in herbals or monks' manuscripts, but it looked a little like parsnip, and when steeped in warm goat's milk, it made people remember things that never happened to them. A boy drank it once and remembered dying in a battle that hadn't happened yet. An old man took a sip and wept for a daughter he'd never had, named Leura. The healers didn't use it lightly. They used it when people were lost to themselves, when grief had hollowed someone like a log or rage had dried the mind to a brittle stalk. A few drops would bring something back, not necessarily the truth, but something gentle, something strange, a soft thought to carry home. They said the root was born of the hill itself, that it grew from the dreams the land no longer needed. Or maybe it was just a parsnip left too long in the ground. No one could say for sure. The last known healer of Hollow Hill vanished one spring after a long frost. Her hut was empty but clean, a fire still warm, tea still steeping. On the table was a note, not written but carved faintly into wood, like a memory trying to speak. Everything remembers, even you. And after that the hill grew quiet again. But now and then, especially on fog-wet mornings when the sheep refuse to climb, villagers swear they see a figure kneeling near the hawthorn tree, hand pressed to the ground, as if listening for something long forgotten, something that still grows beneath. The ink-stained herbal and the recipes that breathed. It sat beneath a stack of crumbling manuscripts in the abbey's quietest corner. A single book, wrapped in faded green wool, tied with a cord spun of nettle and waxed flax, no title on the spine. No author listed, just a faint smell of fennel and old smoke, as if it had once been read beside a dying hearth while snow gathered quietly outside. The monks didn't talk much about the book. They'd inherited it, they said, like everything else, brick by brick, word by word. But when they did speak of it, they called it the breathing herbal, not because the pages moved, but because the recipes inside changed. Sometimes when you returned to the same page, a word or two had shifted, not rewritten, just breathed differently. A preparation that once called for juniper might ask instead for elderflower. The order of steps might be rearranged. The illustration of a leaf might curl subtly left instead of right. It wasn't unsettling exactly. It was like nature had nudged the page. The novice monks found it baffling. The elder scribes warned against copying it directly. Copy the rhythm, one said, not the wording. It won't help otherwise. But those who used it carefully, those who took the time to feel the pulse behind the ink, discovered something else. The recipes in the breathing herbal didn't just describe cures, they whispered stories, a balm for grief that had to be stirred while singing an old lullaby, a poultice that required a tear from someone who had recently laughed, a syrup for night terrors, only effective if poured by moonlight through a sieve of owl feathers. It was medicine, yes, but it was also memory. One ink recipe was rumored to be made from the petals of 7 sleepless nights. Another was brewed with water collected from the corners of a child's dream. The book didn't work for everyone. It stayed silent for those who read too quickly, those who came looking for power. But for those who came tired, or curious, or quietly desperate for some forgotten ease, it opened. One monk who suffered from waking visions claimed the book calmed him. It told me to grow moss on my windowsill, he said, and when I did, the dreams came slower, softer. He later left the order to become a gardener. No one remembers who wrote the herbal. Some said it was pieced together from dozens of voices over hundreds of years. Others thought it had been dreamed into being by a sickly abbess who once spoke in rhymes and saw through her eyelids. The only constant was its ink, dark, glistening, almost alive. Scholars tried to recreate it, but failed. It didn't smear, didn't fade, and in candlelight it looked faintly green, as if the words were still growing. The breathing herbal remains locked now, in a case that no longer fits, but some say, if you pass by on a stormy evening, you can hear it flutter, not from the wind, but from the exhale of a page preparing itself to be read again, and somewhere, maybe in a distant garden, or in the mind of a weary traveler, one of its recipes still works, quietly healing something too old to name. The girl who fell asleep for 7 winters. They didn't talk about her much anymore, not because they'd forgotten, but because the silence had become part of her story. A silence thick as snow, gentle as ash, and spread over the village like a woolen shawl, drawn tight with each winter that passed. Her name, if it was ever spoken aloud, had faded from the chapel records. Some said she was a foundling, brought in during a spring flood. Others said she was born with a caul over her face, and a speck of dried poppy on her tongue. Whatever the truth, the old women remembered her best, not as a child, but as a question. She had been quiet even as a baby, slept too much, smiled too little, but she was never sick. Her cheeks held colour. Her limbs grew long and graceful. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her voice always had the softness of something overheard in a dream. And then, one autumn evening, she simply didn't wake up. She'd fallen asleep beside the hearth, as the first frost crept down the thatch roof, her head resting on a folded linen towel, and the faint scent of lavender still clinging to her sleeves. The midwife checked her breath. It was there, light and steady, no fever, no wounds, no swelling of the tongue or strange spots on the skin, just sleep. At first they waited, they brewed broth, they whispered prayers, they waved rosemary beneath her nose. Someone even tried to play a flute beside her ear, hoping the memory of music might stir something. But she did not wake, not that winter, not the one after. The seasons turned around her, the snows deepened and melted. The village children grew older, but the girl did not change. Her body did not decay or weaken. Her skin remained warm, her hair grew slowly. Her fingernails sometimes needed trimming, but she did not stir. They moved her bed to the old weaver's cottage when spring came. It had thicker walls and quieter corners. Flowers were left by the door. Bread was brought weekly. The local healer, who had once claimed to learn herbcraft from a goose, visited monthly to check her breathing. No one had an answer. But they all felt the same truth when they stood near her. The girl was not gone. She was dreaming. And whatever dream had claimed her was deeper than any story they'd known. By the 4th winter, people began to whisper about the dream itself. Some said she was wandering a forest made entirely of thyme and ash leaves. Others believed she'd passed through a doorway in sleep, and now dined with forgotten queens in underground halls, where fireflies lit the ceilings. A shepherd insisted he'd seen her walking by the river one morning, barefoot, scattering flower petals that floated against the current. The midwife kept notes. By year 5 she'd catalogued nearly a dozen sleeping tonics that had failed to wake the girl, and 3 that nearly roused her before plunging her deeper. One tonic, made with crushed violet, milk from a red goat, and the bark of a tree struck by lightning, made her eyelids flutter. She even whispered a single word no one could understand. But then her face relaxed again, and the breath continued, steady and soft. In the 6th winter, an apothecary visited from far away. He brought a powder made from the sap of a plant that bloomed only beneath eclipses. He charged no coin, only asked for a candle lit in his name if it worked. He stirred the powder into wine and placed 1 drop on the girl's lips. She smiled, just briefly, then slept on. The 7th winter came with thick snow and bright stars, and then she woke. No one knew exactly when. There was no trumpet, no bolt of lightning. Just one morning, the bread was brought to her door as always, and she was standing beside the hearth, leaning gently against the stones, blinking at the light, her hair tangled and her eyes clear. She said little, asked for warm water and a cloak. Then she walked, barefoot, to the chapel and sat in the pew where her cradle once rested. There she remained for hours unmoving, eyes half closed. When the villagers finally dared to ask where she had gone, her answer was simple. I walked through winter. No one pressed her. She didn't explain what that meant. She spoke kindly to the children, helped clean the chapel steps, and always seemed to know which root or herb a person needed most when they were tired or aching. Some said she was touched by saints, others said she'd eaten too many poppy seeds as a child, and time had caught up with her all at once. But no one doubted that she had changed. She never slept more than a few hours after that, never again. And on her last night, many years later, she smiled once more in her bed, breathed in deep, and said quietly, "I've made it back." No one knew from where, but they buried her with lavender and one small vial of violet powder, in case dreams waited for her on the other side. Dandelion wine, and the silence beneath the cellar. There's a kind of silence that only lives beneath old floors. Not the silence of sleep or stillness, but the deeper kind, the hush that comes from time pressing down through beams and stone, layering itself like dust in forgotten corners. In some villages, that hush clung strongest in the cellars, where cool air coiled around clay jugs and cobwebs danced in lamplight. And in one such cellar, beneath a crooked house at the edge of the fields, there was a row of bottles filled with golden liquid, thick and glimmering, like late sunlight poured into glass. Dandelion wine. Not just any wine. This one was made from flowers picked under a specific moon, after the last frost, but before the swallows returned. The petals had to be plucked at dawn, before they curled shut, and once collected, they were steeped with honey, old well water, and sometimes something else. It wasn't written down, of course. Recipes like that never were. They were passed along in fragments, whispered through splinters in the kitchen table, or tucked into songs sung while stirring the pot. The woman who made the wine was called Old Brielle, though she wasn't particularly old, just quiet and always covered in pollen. Her hair was long, her hands stained yellow from the petals, and her cellar was never open to guests. She'd begun the tradition when she was young, learning from an aunt who claimed to have spoken once to a bee that knew the name of every flower. They said that if you brewed it right, and drank it slow, the wine could calm the bones, ease grief, and once in a great while, let you hear something that wasn't quite from here, something from beneath the cellar. Not a ghost, not quite, just a voice that belonged to the earth, or the wine, or maybe the quiet beneath both. Brielle never claimed it herself, but villagers said the wine made you dream of meadows no one remembered, or people you hadn't yet met. One man claimed he heard his mother humming a lullaby. He never knew she knew. Another woman fell asleep in her chair, and woke up with tears in her eyes, certain she'd just had a conversation with her first love, dead 20 years, but still laughing in her dream. Not everyone had the same experience. Some just tasted honey and spring, but the cellar remained a place of quiet fascination. Every year Brielle made only 7 bottles. They were kept in the coolest part of the cellar, under a plank with a knot shaped like an eye. Each bottle was wrapped in cloth and tied with string made from nettle fibers. No one touched them but her. But one year something shifted. A harvest came late, a strange wind blew through the hills, and the bees disappeared for 6 days. When Brielle finally picked the flowers, they were fewer, but stronger in scent. She brewed the wine the same way, methodical, silent, precise. Yet as it fermented, the cellar changed. The silence grew louder. Visitors who walked past her cottage began to feel dizzy, as if the ground beneath them wasn't quite steady. A cat refused to cross her doorstep. A candle burned out mid-prayer, and when the wine was finished, Brielle didn't bottle it. She left it in the cask, untouched. It sat beneath the floor for a full year, breathing slowly through the wood. No one saw her for months. But then, one late summer evening, a boy delivering eggs found her outside, sitting on a stool beside the cellar door, humming to herself and smiling. The boy said the humming didn't sound like a song. It sounded like a field. Not wind, not words, just a kind of music you could only hear if you'd been quiet for a very, very long time. Eventually she poured the wine. It was darker that year, amber leaning into brown, with a shimmer that never settled. She offered a glass to no one in particular, just placed it on the floor of the cellar, and whispered, "Thank you." That bottle was never seen again. But the others, she poured them carefully, one at a time, for the people who needed them most, and every single one who drank from it that year claimed the same thing. The wine tasted like something they'd forgotten, but had always missed. Something buried deep, like a lullaby from childhood, or a friend you almost remembered having, or a garden that once grew beside a house you'd never lived in. And when the last bottle was gone, Brielle closed the cellar for good. She boarded it up, built a bench over the hatch, planted rosemary all around it, and she never made wine again. But if you ever visit that village, and sit on the bench at sunset, they say the silence underneath still hums, very softly, like the sound of dandelions breathing. The bees that knew which flowers were dangerous. Some hives hummed differently, not louder, not softer, but with a rhythm that seemed to ripple through the air in strange patterns, like a song meant only for the trees. In a shaded meadow on the outskirts of an old village, where stone paths turned to moss and forgotten graves leaned beneath ivy, there was a bee colony known for just that sort of hum. The villagers said they were smart bees, not in the usual sense, no tiny glasses or scrolls of parchment, but with a kind of wisdom that came from living among herbs no one else dared to touch. Their hive was nestled into the hollow of a tree that was older than the church, with bark that flaked like old paint and roots that curled like resting fingers. No one knew who first placed the hive there. It had always been there, as far as anyone remembered, and for as long as it stood, the bees had only gathered nectar from very particular flowers, not the roses or daisies, not the safe, round blooms near the gardens. These bees flew in tight, swirling paths around the edges of the fields, down into low places where the soil stayed damp and shadows lingered. They danced above foxglove and datura, among angel's trumpet and the sharp sweet breath of hemlock, plants no healer would gather without whispering an apology. It was an old midwife who first noticed what the bees were doing. Her name was Adela, and she'd seen enough of the world to know that nature kept secrets in layers. She would sit by the meadow in the early mornings, with a shawl around her shoulders and a pot of something warm between her hands, and simply watch them work. They know, she once said, barely loud enough to be heard. They know what hurts and what heals. They know what dreams are made of. People laughed, of course. Old women always say things like that. But one year the laughter faded, because that was the summer of the sleep. A strange and gentle illness swept through the village, not painful, not feverish, but heavy, like being wrapped in invisible wool. One by one, people drifted into a kind of waking dream. They stopped speaking clearly, forgot what day it was, wandered the streets with far-off smiles and hands that twitched like they were weaving something that wasn't there. They weren't afraid, just very far away. And it all seemed to begin with a gift, a jar of honey, thick, golden and faintly tinged with green. It had been left anonymously on the altar of the chapel. No note, no explanation, just a smooth glass jar sealed with wax and tied with a bit of faded red cloth. The priest, not one to waste a blessing, used it to sweeten the bread for the poor. That was the beginning. Adela knew right away. The bees, the flowers, the hush that followed the sweetness. She didn't panic, she didn't run, she simply gathered her shawl, stood up from her stool, and walked to the tree with the hive. She sat beneath it and listened. The bees were louder that day, restless, their spiral dances no longer tight and neat, but erratic, looping in strange curves that traced invisible letters into the air. No one knew what she heard, or if she even spoke to them, but the next morning, the hive was gone, not emptied, vanished. The hollow in the tree was just that, empty wood, dry and clean, as if nothing had ever lived there. The meadow was silent. The herbs that had once grown along the edge had withered overnight, petals curled inwards like a secret no longer safe to share. The sleep slowly lifted. One by one, the villagers returned to themselves, confused and foggy but unharmed. They remembered bits and pieces, dreams of long tables beneath the moon, voices singing in languages no one had taught them, and the warm weight of unseen hands brushing hair from their foreheads. No one ever found out where the honey came from. No one asked too loudly, either. But for years afterward, when a child in the village was born with a strange glint in their eye, or a widow dreamed of her husband smiling from a garden that never existed, they'd say quietly, maybe it was the bees, and they'd light a candle, just in case, because some hives hum differently, and some bees know more than they let on. The lantern keeper's tea of forgetting and flame. They said the lantern keeper never slept, a small man half lost in his own robes, with soot permanently lining the edges of his fingernails. His beard had grown into the shape of the wind, and his eyes flickered like candlelight even in broad daylight. No one remembered when he first came to the village, only that the tower had always needed tending, and he was always there to tend it. The tower stood just beyond the last house, past the low wall where the sheep rarely wandered, and the moss grew like velvet across the stones. It wasn't especially tall or grand, just a squat thing of old stone and wood with a spiral staircase, so narrow it felt like you had to breathe in just to climb it. At its top, a lantern burned, always, even on nights when the moon refused to rise, when storms wrapped the village in thunder, and the world seemed too soaked to catch a spark. That light glowed on, a pale, steady eye watching something only it could see. The villagers brought the lantern keeper gifts, but he never accepted coin. Instead, he traded in tea, strange teas brewed over embers so dark they smoked blue. His teas had names whispered like confessions. Dreambone Brew, Fogdrop, Emberoot Sleep, and the most famous of all, Tea of Forgetting and Flame. No one knew what was in it, but those who drank it claimed that it did exactly as promised. First it burned, not like fire on the tongue but deep, like memory itself catching light. And then, gently, quietly, it erased worries, regrets, names, sometimes even faces, all gone, like old letters tossed into a river. A widow drank it once, after her grief became too heavy. When she awoke, she couldn't recall her husband's face. She cried for a week, not knowing why. A soldier drank it to forget a scream that followed him in dreams. Afterward, he couldn't even remember which side he fought for. It was a dangerous tea. But then again, many of the best things were. What made it especially strange, though, wasn't its effects. It was where it came from. Because the Lantern Keeper never left the tower. The herbs, the bark, the oils, he claimed they were all harvested from the flame itself. He would lean in close, whisper something no one else could hear, and then reach through the light, as if drawing from a secret garden no one could see. They said the lantern's fire burned a little different after he brewed, quieter, as though tired. Some believed the tea was a kind of pact, a trade between light and shadow, that every time someone forgot, something in the flame remembered for them. One evening, just before the first frost, a boy climbed the tower out of curiosity. He'd heard stories and wanted to see if the fire really whispered. He didn't come down for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he was older, not in body, but in silence. His hands moved differently. His eyes looked past people instead of at them. When asked what he saw, he only said, "The tea isn't made, it's offered." Years passed. The Lantern Keeper grew older, but the flame never dimmed. No matter how grey his beard became, or how thin his voice, the tower remained lit. And on nights when the village felt heavy with memory, when names felt too sharp or yesterdays too loud, someone would climb the hill, knock softly at the tower door, and whisper, "I'd like to forget, just a little." And somewhere within, a kettle would start to boil, steam would rise, the flame would flicker, and the tea would be poured. Not everyone drank it, not everyone needed to, but for those who did, the forgetting wasn't frightening. It was quiet, warm, like placing something heavy on a high shelf, knowing you wouldn't need it again. Not because it wasn't important, but because the fire was now holding it for you, and it always would.